The mist rose lazily over the River Thames, wrapping the city of London in a dense, chilly silence, as if time itself were holding its breath. It was the month of July, in the year of our Lord 1535, and the bells of the Abbey tolled with a solemn, foreboding sound. At the heart of the Tower of London, a man with grey hair and a calm face knelt before a plain wooden cross, murmuring words that no one could hear, no one, except heaven. He was a prisoner, and yet his spirit knew no chains. His clothes were simple, his cell austere, but in his gaze burned a light so clear and deep that no shadow could touch it. His name was Thomas More, and throughout England, his name had been feared, admired, and revered. Philosopher, humanist, jurist, Lord Chancellor to the King. And now, prisoner of conscience. "Lord," he whispered, "let me never fear man so much that I forget to fear you." Long gone were the golden days at court, the debates with Erasmus, the afternoons of study with his daughter Margaret, the laughter shared beside the fire. All that remained behind like a dream, like a boat drifting away from shore when the tides of the world change without warning. Before him stood only death and the shining certainty that he had never betrayed the secret voice God had placed in his soul. The jailer knocked on the iron door. "Sir Thomas," he announced quietly, "the hour has come." Thomas rose calmly. He took the small wooden crucifix in his hands, kissed the Saviour's face, and walked to his fate without trembling. Outside, footsteps echoed down the damp corridors of the tower, like the footsteps of a judgment that did not belong to this world. Crowds had already gathered at the scaffold, some curious, some compassionate. A few whispered the king's name in fear, others More's name, with reverence. "I die the king's good servant," he would say minutes later, "but God's first." This is the story of a man who chose silence over betrayal, justice over comfort, and the cross over the throne. This is the story of Thomas More, martyr of truth, witness of the unconquerable conscience, mirror of a hope that death could never extinguish. The air of London in the winter of 1478 was thick with smoke, market cries, and the sound of bells. From the earliest hours of the day, the city pulsed like a living organism, merchants shouting their wares, the pounding of hooves on cobbled streets, and the chime of prayers rising from the tall towers of St. Paul's. In a modest red brick house near the church of St. Lawrence Jury, a child was born whose destiny would one day challenge the very pillars of the throne. His name was Thomas, and his first cries mingled with the murmuring of the Thames, as if his soul had been bound from the beginning to the deep current of an England caught between tradition and change. He was the son of John More, a respected judge of the realm, a man of strict discipline and a conscience tempered like steel. His mother, whose gentleness would never leave Thomas's memory, taught him to pray with the same solemnity others used to teach their children to walk. From an early age, Thomas showed a keen, searching gaze, one that wasn't content with appearances, but reached for the unseen pulse behind everything. He loved the stories of saints and martyrs his mother told by the fireside, but he was equally fascinated by the legal debates his father held with colleagues over the dinner table. Between canon law manuscripts and worn rosary beads, his soul grew like a rosebush blooming among stones. "Thomas," his father said one evening as they reviewed passages from the City of God, "the world needs men with heads, but also with hearts." "And if I have to choose between the two, Father," asked the boy with the gravity of an old man. "Then choose your soul, my son. The mind can be deceived, the heart can betray, but the soul answers only to God." Young Thomas studied at St. Anthony's School, where he quickly stood out for his sharp logic and fluent Latin. His teachers remembered him as a diligent student, blessed with an extraordinary memory, but also cheerful, with a refined wit that, even in childhood, hinted at the humor that would one day shake the halls of power. It was not unusual to find him gently mocking the pomp of certain teachers or reciting long passages of Seneca as if they were songs. At the age of 14, Thomas was sent to Oxford. He walked its ancient stone streets with the awe of someone stepping into a roofless cathedral. Oxford, with its ivy-covered towers and air scented with ink, incense, and debate, was the crucible where the souls of scholars and the ambitious were forged. Amid Gothic cloisters and dusty libraries, a young man named Thomas More walked the university corridors like a pilgrim among temples of knowledge. He was just 14 when he arrived, and already his professors whispered among themselves with admiration, "That boy thinks with Aristotle's logic and the soul of a monk." It was the end of the 15th century, and Europe was slowly awakening from the long darkness of the medieval age. A fresh breath of life swept through the intellectual centers: humanism. Not a denial of the divine, but a desire to restore human dignity in the light of the gospel and the classical world. Thomas More absorbed this spirit eagerly, immersed in the writings of Cicero, Seneca, and Plato. But he also prayed in silence before forgotten altars in empty chapels, as if his soul already sensed that no truth is complete unless it passes through the cross. It was during this time that he met John Colet, a restless cleric with a fiery gaze who spoke of St. Paul with the passion of one in love. Colet opened the doors to a purified faith, free from superstition and close to the heart. From his lips, Thomas learned that it was not enough to think clearly. One had to live with integrity. "Thomas," Colet told him one afternoon as they strolled through the gardens of Magdalen College, "Christianity is not a custom. It's a fire, and if it doesn't consume you, you haven't truly understood it." Those words fell like seed on fertile ground. Questions began to sprout, quietly at first, then like a storm. What path should he take? The way of study and politics, where his sharp mind had room to flourish, or the path of contemplative retreat, where his soul found deep and quiet joy? That tension between the cloister and the world became a sweet burden, like a cross not yet imposed but already felt. At 17, Thomas left Oxford temporarily and went to live with the Carthusians in London. There, within the silent walls of the Charterhouse Monastery, he tested the monastic life. He awoke in the middle of the night for matins, slept on a wooden board, and ate only bread and vegetables. His soul found peace, but his mind was restless. "Lord," he wrote in his notebook, "if this is your will, make it mine as well. But if not, then don't let me be fooled by the desire to flee the world, when what you ask is for me to transform it." The monks saw in him a true sanctity, but also a fire that didn't quite fit the mold of absolute renunciation. Thomas loved silence, but also laughter. He admired solitude, but found beauty in the art of conversation. Even in the shadow of the cloister, his eyes looked outward, as if he already sensed God was calling him to serve among people, not apart from them. He returned to public life, but without abandoning prayer. He enrolled at Lincoln's Inn, London's Center for Legal Studies, and soon became a jurist. And yet he was unlike the others. He refused bribes, defended the poor, and examined every case with the gospel in one hand and the laws of the realm in the other. It was around this time that Erasmus of Rotterdam, passing through England, heard of a young lawyer who rose before dawn to pray the divine office and who, instead of mocking the poor, welcomed them into his chambers. They met on a rainy afternoon, and their friendship would become an intellectual and spiritual bond that lasted decades. Together, they dreamed of a moral reform of the Church, a Christianity that was joyful, wise, and deeply human. "Thomas," Erasmus said after their first conversation, "if power ever tries to buy your soul, let it know it will be dealing with a man, not with a price." That seed, too, would grow. And so, between Carthusian prayers, legal chambers, letters with Erasmus and walks with Cole, young More discovered that his vocation was not to flee the world, but to lift it up. He would not be a monk of the cell, but a monk in robes. His cell would be his conscience and his habit, the law of God written on his heart. Even then, the quiet strength was forming within him, that immovable calm that would one day stand firm before the storm of power. For while others learned to live with a sleeping conscience, Thomas was learning to listen to it as if it were the voice of God himself. If great souls find their temple in the conscience, Thomas More found his monastery at home. After years of study, discernment, and legal service, he embraced an even more radical vocation, that of husband and father. In an age when marriage was often seen as a social contract or a means to climb the ranks, Thomas understood it as a school of holiness. He married Jane Colt, a young woman with a gentle heart and soft voice, to whom he not only taught Latin and music, but also how to read the scriptures with an open soul. His house in Chelsea, along the banks of the Thames, was neither lavish nor grand, but inside there reigned such harmony that many called it a paradise of papers and prayers. There the sound of the lute intertwined with the singing of psalms, and the children's play was only interrupted by the Angelus at midday. Thomas was a man of state, yes, but first and foremost, he was a father. "I don't want to raise scholars," he would say tenderly to his children. "I want to raise souls that live in truth and die with honor." His eldest daughter, Margaret, became his confidant, his disciple, his mirror. With a lively mind and steady soul, she was the only one who could challenge him in a debate without fear. Their bond transcended blood. It was a communion of spirit. Often they were seen walking together at the garden's edge, discussing the Stoics or translating the Church Fathers from Greek into English. But joy rarely comes without shadow. Jane fell ill and died young. On her deathbed, Thomas held her hand and prayed Psalm 90 with her. Death did not break his spirit, but it left a deep void. Now a widower with small children, he eventually married again. Alice Middleton, a strong-willed widow, more practical than pious but fiercely loyal. With her he found companionship in the years to come, though never the soul-deep intimacy he had known with Jane. In Thomas's home, no ill was spoken of others. Injustice was not tolerated, and no one was scorned for their social standing. Even the servants joined in the evening readings of the Gospel. Everyone was treated as part of a larger family, God's family. Charity was practiced in secret and prayer without display. There was no room for hypocrisy. "If you cannot speak truth at your own table," he would say to his children, "how do you expect to speak it before the court of men?" That household also became a school for intellectuals. Erasmus visited more than once, and famously said he knew of no home more joyful or more holy than Thomas's. There, books were written, classics translated, Compline prayed, and dice games played, all with equal ease. It was a microcosm of the Christian vision of life, beauty, order, joy, and the cross. Yet it wasn't all retreat and contemplation. Thomas, from his seat in Parliament, quickly gained attention for defending the people against abuses of power. He wasn't afraid to challenge nobles or corrupt clerics. He spoke the truth, even when that truth won him enemies. His reputation for integrity spread, and with it, the respect of even those who opposed him. But in private, Thomas examined his conscience nightly. He prayed the divine office, confessed frequently, and asked God not for comfort, but for strength to remain true. His constant joy, sharp wit, and ability to laugh in the midst of tension were not masks. They were fruits of a deep peace, born from knowing who he was, whom he served, and what price he was willing to pay. One autumn afternoon, while playing chess with Margaret in the library, she looked at him curiously and asked, "Father, What would you do if one day you had to choose between the king and God? Thomas paused. He held the white king piece in his fingers and raised it to the light. Then I would call check on the world, he answered softly, because there is only one throne before which every man must kneel, and that throne is not in London, but in heaven. That home, among the golden leaves of Chelsea and the open pages of Scripture, was the crucible where a martyr's character was forged. Not a heroic figure of legend, but a father, a servant, a friend, and a saint. Soon that man of gentle face and incorruptible soul would be called to the highest post in the kingdom. But even then, Thomas had already learned that no title is worth the cost of one's soul. And his conscience, his strongest fortress, was about to be tested like never before. It was the year of our Lord 1529, and the bells of Westminster Abbey rang with an unfamiliar tone. For the first time, King Henry VIII had appointed a man outside the clergy as Lord Chancellor of England. He was not a noble, nor a courtier. He was a humanist, a jurist, and an incorruptible Christian. His name, Thomas More. The announcement spread in murmurs. Some hailed it as a triumph of virtue and intellect. Others looked on with suspicion. They knew that this man, who laughed with the humble and quoted Cicero at the royal table, could not be bought with gold or flattery. And in court, that was more dangerous than heresy. From the very first day, Thomas brought his cross with him into the palace. He was not dazzled by silk or feasts. He still rose at dawn to pray, fasted on Fridays, and spent his spare time visiting the poor. Though he wore the robe of power, he never forgot the cloak of humility. Lord Chancellor, a courtier asked him during a session, "How do you remain so calm when so many wish to see you fall?" Thomas smiled with gentle irony and replied, "When one knows he will stand before a higher court than the king's, the whispers of the palace sound like children's songs." His governance was upright and firm. He fought corruption, protected peasants, and refused to condemn anyone for heresy without solid evidence. The people admired him, the nobles feared him, the king wavered between esteem and suspicion. But then, the storm began to gather over England. Henry VIII, still without a male heir after years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, sought an annulment. The Pope, caught in the political cross-currents of Europe, refused. Frustrated, Henry chose to sever ties with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church in England. What began as a marital crisis soon became a spiritual revolution. Thomas watched it all unfold from his office, as one might watch a dark wave approaching, threatening to engulf both altar and throne. He had served the king faithfully, but now his loyalty was cleaved in two. The monarch no longer demanded political obedience, he demanded spiritual allegiance. He wanted all to acknowledge his supremacy over the church, and for Thomas, that meant betraying Christ. For weeks he avoided direct confrontation. He maintained a cautious silence. He did not criticize the king, but he also signed no documents. He attended no ceremonies. He was absent from the weddings. He prayed more. He fasted more. He hoped the storm would pass. But in the palace halls, he was already being watched with suspicion, and Henry felt him as a moral shadow that refused to disappear. One afternoon, Thomas was summoned before the king. The hall was adorned with tapestries, candles, and the king's new wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry greeted him with a strained smile. "Thomas," he said, "I need your counsel. You are the wisest man in the realm. Don't you think the throne of England deserves a legitimate heir?" Thomas lowered his gaze. "Your Majesty, the throne deserves justice, and justice cannot be manufactured outside the bounds of truth." "And isn't it true," Henry snapped, "that the Pope meddles in my affairs?" "It is true," Thomas answered, steady and composed, "that some things lie beyond the power of both kings and popes. There are laws not written by men, but by God." Silence filled the room. The king pressed his lips together and said no more. But that day Thomas knew his fall was already set in motion. Weeks later, he resigned as Lord Chancellor. He did so without speeches or ceremony, to be silent. In an age where every word was a political weight, a sentence of life or a betrayal of soul, Thomas More chose silence. Not like cowards who hide, nor like accomplices who make pacts with the shadows, but like saints who know that when speaking means betraying the truth, silence becomes a shield. After resigning as Chancellor, Thomas withdrew to Chelsea, where his home remained a refuge of peace amid gathering storms. There he continued to pray, study, walk among the trees with Margaret, read psalms at dusk, teach logic to his children, and pray the rosary in the quiet of night. Yet each week brought new envoys from the king, new documents demanding his signature, new attempts to wrest from him a single word that would compromise him. "We don't need him to speak," said Thomas Cromwell, the king's counselor. "All we need is his signature. The people follow him in secret. His example is a thorn in the king's side." And Thomas, hearing of these murmurs, would gently tell his family, "I do not keep silent out of pride nor out of vanity. I am silent because I know that every word I say will be used to condemn or to deny Christ, and I refuse to do either." The law of the realm now demanded that all swear the Act of Supremacy, a document declaring King Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church in England. The bishops had signed. The nobles too. Even close friends of Thomas, pious men, had conceded, some with tears in their eyes, but not him. He did not sign, he did not speak, he did not accuse the king, nor did he defend him. He simply maintained a serene silence, like a martyr walking toward an inner Golgotha. One day, while praying in his library, he received an official letter. He was summoned before the royal council. Margaret read the summons aloud and felt a chill run down her spine. Thomas took her hands, looked at her with tenderness and said, "Do not be afraid, my daughter. God's will has never failed me, and if this is the hour of my trial, I wish to face it with joy." Dressed simply, without escort or fanfare, Thomas presented himself before the council. They offered him one last chance to sign. They did not insult him nor threaten him. They simply showed him the document, with all the names of those who had already yielded. "We do not wish to destroy you," said Cromwell. "We respect you. All we ask is your loyalty to the king. No explanation is needed, just your signature." Thomas looked at the paper, then at his judges, and finally at the heavens. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his gaze was as firm as a blade. "What I think on this matter," he declared, "has not been said, and it will not be said, for even silence in certain times is a confession, and I would rather be judged for what I did not say than damn myself by uttering what I should have kept quiet." The sentence came swiftly. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The cell assigned to him was cold, damp, nearly empty. There, where time itself seemed to halt, Thomas found comfort in the scriptures. He prayed the Psalms from memory. He wrote letters to his family, especially Margaret, letters that glowed with a unique blend of tenderness, depth, and humor. He never spoke ill of his accusers. He showed no bitterness. He would say, "I am in the tower, but not in despair. My body is imprisoned, but my conscience, she is as free as the angels of heaven." The king, frustrated, sought new ways to apply pressure. They reduced his rations. They barred all visits. They confiscated his books. They isolated him, as if trying to make him forget who he was. But each morning, the guards found him praying, singing psalms, or writing fragments of the gospel on the walls with charcoal. One day, a soldier, moved by his peace, asked, "How can you smile? knowing they've taken everything from you. And Thomas, with a faint smile, answered, I have not lost everything, good friend. I still have my conscience, and God knows that is enough. The months passed, and his silence weighed more than the words of 1,000 men. His very presence became a living rebuke. For when men of honor fall, the invisible walls that uphold justice begin to crumble. And Thomas was one of those pillars that could not be bent. His daughter Margaret was finally granted permission to see him one last time. She embraced him fiercely, weeping, and begged him to sign, just for them, for the family, for the love he bore them. Thomas held her in his arms, tears in his eyes, and said with quiet conviction, Dear child, love is not about preserving the flesh at all costs, but about remaining in the truth. If truth separates us for a time, it will unite us forever in heaven. Margaret understood, and she kissed him one last time. The silence Thomas More kept was not cowardice, it was fidelity. It was not evasion, it was martyrdom. For in a time when everyone spoke to please, he chose to be silent, to obey, and that silence spoke everything. The final sentence would come soon. But before his death, Thomas would prove that one man alone, armed only with the light of his conscience, could challenge an empire and prevail. The morning broke gray over London. A light drizzle whispered across the rooftops like a quiet morning yet to be spoken. In the tower, Thomas More had slept little. His body was thin, his clothes worn, yet his face bore the same tempered peace that disarmed even the hardest jailer. He knew the hour had come, and he did not tremble. "Are you ready?" asked one of the guards as he placed the mantle on More's shoulders for the trial. "I've had more than enough time to prepare my soul," he replied with a faint smile. "The rest is merely human formality." The trial was held at Westminster Hall. It was packed. Nobles, clergymen, royal envoys, predisposed judges, and a public torn between fear and admiration. On the dais stood Thomas Cromwell, directing the proceedings with cold resolve. The charge: high treason, for refusing to acknowledge the king as supreme head of the church in England. More entered unaccompanied, walking firmly without glancing to the sides. He bowed briefly to the judges, not out of courtesy, but out of respect for the institution of justice, even though he knew in his heart the verdict had been written before the first argument was spoken. "Sir Thomas," the prosecutor said with a rehearsed tone, "do you acknowledge Parliament's authority to name the king as head of the church?" Silence. "Why do you refuse to swear the act of supremacy?" Thomas raised his eyes and spoke with calm. "I have never spoken a word against the king's authority, and if silence can be called treason, then neither conscience nor law is safe in this realm. For silence is not falsehood, and I did not swear because I could not swear without wounding God." The judges shifted uneasily. They had not expected such eloquence from a weakened prisoner. But Cromwell, relentless, presented a witness, a man named Richard Rich, who claimed to have heard Thomas explicitly deny the king's supremacy. "That is false," declared More with quiet firmness. "I never uttered such words, and if my condemnation must rest on the testimony of one man, whose soul I know well, then this trial is no light, but shadow." But it didn't matter. The verdict had been sealed. The judges declared him guilty. The crowd held its breath. Thomas bowed his head slightly. Then, with dignity, he asked for leave to speak once more. "My lords," he said, "I have always been the king's faithful servant. No act or word of mine proves otherwise, but I am also a servant of God. And if I am forced to choose between the law of man and the law eternal, then I choose to die as the king's good servant, but God's first." Silence fell. A dense silence, filled with something even the judges and soldiers could not name. Some lowered their gaze. Others crossed themselves discreetly. The sentence was pronounced death by beheading. The prisoner would be taken to Tower Hill to die as a traitor. But within himself, Thomas knew that it was not his head that would fall, but the fear of all those still uncertain whether to live standing or die in truth. In his cell, he wrote his final letter to Margaret. It was short, but each line weighed like lead and burned like gold. "My dear daughter," he wrote, "do not weep for me. I have lost nothing worth more than what I am about to gain. Stay firm as I have tried to be. And when you remember me, do not think of a dead father, but a living soul who awaits you, where there are no kings and no prisons." The morning of the execution was bright. The sky opened as if God himself came to witness the sacrifice of his servant. Thomas walked to the scaffold with calm steps. He greeted the executioner, handed him a silver coin, and said with courtesy, "Be of good cheer, good man, and do not fear to do your duty. You will sever my head, but not my soul." He knelt. He prayed quietly. Then he looked up to heaven. His final words, spoken clearly before the crowd, were, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." The axe fell, and with it not a traitor, but a witness. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, but his memory began to shine like a flame that cannot be extinguished. For while power clings to its throne, the saints rise beyond all empires. Thomas More died that day. But his conscience did not. And in every generation, when a man or woman is forced to choose between comfort and truth, between the world and the cross, the echo of his silence, the weight of his faith, and the strength of his soul rise once more. Like an invisible crown, not forged by human hands, but by truth itself. Years passed. Monarchs changed, laws were rewritten, empires rose and fell. The names of many powerful men who had sentenced Thomas More faded into the mist of history like smoke. But his memory, like an eternal flame, remained lit in the heart of the Church and of humanity, because there are deaths that do not end a story, but open a path. For centuries, his writings, his letters, his gestures of tenderness and resistance have been read with tears by martyrs, students, leaders, and fathers. Erasmus, his friend, once wrote that he had never known a man more wise or more faithful, and his daughter Margaret, his most devoted disciple, dedicated her life to preserving his memory, not as a monument of stone, but as a living seed of conscience. In 1935, 4 centuries after his martyrdom, the Church officially declared him a saint. Pope Pius XI called him a model of integrity for all lay people committed to public life. Later, John Paul II named him patron of politicians and public servants, a guiding light for those who walk the delicate line between temporal duty and eternal fidelity. But the sanctity of Thomas More does not rest only in his title, his martyrdom, or the eloquence of his judgments. His sanctity lies in the way he lived, with a conscience as steadfast as it was compassionate, as deeply Christian as it was joyfully human. He knew how to defend truth without violence, without hatred, without revenge. He knew how to lose everything with grace, and he knew how to die with a heavenly smile on his lips. Today, in a world that often rewards ambiguity, celebrates superficiality, and mocks fidelity, the figure of Thomas More stands as a calm beacon in the midst of the storm. He reminds us that integrity is not rigidity, but the harmony between what we believe, what we say, and what we do. That politics, when it does not come from the soul, becomes mere theater. And that conscience, when formed in the light of God, is more powerful than any crown. Perhaps that is why, even now, when a believer faces a difficult decision, when a public servant stands between convenience and justice, when a parent teaches their child to tell the truth no matter the cost, the name of Thomas More reappears, silent but invincible, because truth does not shout, it does not impose, it does not threaten. Truth endures. And his life was just that, a persistence of light in the midst of shadow, a fidelity without show, a soul that could not be bought nor broken. St. Thomas More, martyr of conscience, patron of just leaders, example of joy in the midst of trial. Pray for us.